Next week, Australia is set to become the first democracy to ban kids under 16 from using social media. TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, the lot.
Are you under 16 and on Snapchat? If so, now's the time to start saving all your memories because your time on the app is almost up.
We want Australian parents and families to know that we've got your back. Young people under the age of 16 will not be able to have accounts on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, X, amongst other platforms.
It's something I definitely agree with.
I agree with it, but they'll find a way around it for sure.
It doesn't really deal with the root causes of why social media is not a safe place for young people.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones, and this is the Bloomberg Australia podcast, where each week we go behind the biggest stories shaping Australia's place in global business. This week, kids using social media. It's about to be banned in a huge swing from the Australian government to try and limit the harm these platforms cause. But not everyone is convinced this is going to work, and the debate has been fierce. One thing, however, is undisputed. The world is paying attention right now to Australia. Today I'm joined by someone who's been watching the back and forth between big tech, worried parents and the Australian government. Angus Whitley is a global business reporter based in our Sydney newsroom. Angus, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks, Beck. Good to be with you again.
Angus, a lot of us are addicted to our phones and apps and things, and so it does make sense that our kids are going to follow suit. What's your relationship like with social media? Could you use some time out?
Do you know what? I think I could probably use some time in. I'm not sure I have a relationship with social media, and I think people who would like to get hold of me more often probably say I should be addicted to my phone more. So, yeah, I think I'm probably not the right person to ask there.
So I have no comment if the same question is asked back at me, but, you know, I'm trying to get better. Let's take a step back at this issue to start with, Angus. Can you talk me through the origins of this, groundbreaking legislation that's coming into effect on December 10 here in Australia?
I think this is a story that perhaps some people in Australia might have heard. I doubt if many people outside of Australia would have heard this story about the origins of Australia's nationwide social media ban that, as you said, will kick in on December the 10th. And you really have to go back in time to 2024 and to Adelaide in South Australia, where the wife of the Premier, Peter Malinauskas, was reading Jonathan Haidt's best-selling book, The Anxious Generation, which came out in 2024. And in this book, Haidt argues that essentially excessive phone use by children and excessive social media access by children had triggered an unprecedented mental health crisis. And shortly after this book was released, Peter Malinauskas' wife was reading it. And I interviewed Peter Malinauskas and said, just, tell me the story again. Is this really true? And he said, I'll never forget it. My wife put the book down one night. They were in bed one night in Adelaide at their home. And she said, you've got to bloody do something about this. And Peter Malinauskas said he'd never forget that moment. And he thought about it and he thought, maybe there is something I could do about that. And shortly after that, he proposed statewide age restrictions. That was in September 2024. And within 2 months, the law had passed federally. So that's what Malinauskas described as warp speed reform. And it is. For something of this significance, that is just incredible. So there was real momentum behind this legislation. It had been brewing, but from a period of, I guess, middle of 2024 until November 24, it went from this kind of idea, this moment, if you like, late at night in Adelaide between a premier and his wife, into federal law that was, pretty consequential, and it's turning out to be that way. That was incredible, that story.
I want to pick up on a few things that you just mentioned there about the origins, but I do want to ask you first about these kids that are affected by this ban that's coming into effect next week. What happens to the ones that have already got social media profiles under this new legislation?
Yeah, it's worth looking at the fine print, I think, because it's kind of how would you say, it's shorthanded and it loses a bit of detail as people pass it around. But the law is quite simple. It bans under 16s from having social media accounts from December 10th, and it prescribes that. And it details 10 social media platforms, I think from last count, that are banned, and a bunch that are allowed. So if you're under 16, your account will be closed, and you may have the choice of archiving the content or putting it in the freezer, if you like, until you're over 16. If you're under 16, you won't be able to open a new account. And if you're over 16 and you get told you're under 16, you'll be able to challenge that decision as well. So that's the process. And how will these big tech firms, including Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, YouTube as well, how will they determine this? Well, they'll be using a variety of techniques and tools, if you like, ranging from video selfies that look at your mannerisms, your tone of voice, your face, to determine whether you are 16 or not. They might look at some government identification, although that can't be your only option under the law. Or they might look at simply the way you behave online. If they don't have enough evidence, if they don't have an piece of identification, they might just look at who your friends are. Like, when are you on? When are you off? Does your sort of access follow the hours of school, perhaps? Or what kind of language do you use? What kind of sites are you browsing? So that may take a little bit of time. So it'll be interesting to see what happens on December 10th, because there will be some kids who clearly are under 16 because they've declared themselves to be over 13, which of course is the legal access age at the moment. So it could be a bit messy from December 10th, but it may take a bit of time before tech platforms determine who is what age.
And as you say, I mean, it's impressive that this legislation has passed, in warp speed time. But what has big tech had to say in response to this? Surely this is putting like a big dent into its pipeline of users and future users.
Big tech has not liked this legislation from the outset. And from late November, when it passed, what Malinowskis would describe as warp speed pace, they have complained that this legislation has suffered from a lack of consultation. And I put that to Malinowskis when I interviewed him and said, well, of course they'd say that. Big tech would like to consult for a decade. Endless consultation would suit them. But, a lot of people other than big tech have said this passage of law was accelerated and rushed through in faster than usual time frame. But more specifically, their arguments are that bans are broadly blunt and ineffective, and there's little evidence that bans around the world have actually worked. They also argue that having kids access social media in a logged-out phase, which Australia's law prescribes, will not make them safer, because they will be outside the sort of the safety perimeter, if you like, of social media. They won't have the safeguards, the regulation, perhaps the features of an account that come with being logged in. And there's also an argument that if they're not allowed to be on Snapchat, where will they go? They need to communicate, they need to chat, they need to form communities. Will they disappear into darker corners of the internet that are frankly dangerous? And we won't know, and they won't be able to raise the alarm because there won't be the means, or they may not feel safe saying they're there. So there are plenty of arguments against this ban, but it's wildly popular with parents, or at least it was when it was passed through Parliament.
Australia is not the only country that's been looking at this problem for quite some time. In the recent story that you did for Bloomberg, you mentioned other countries are also looking into limiting access for kids on social media. I'm interested to hear a little bit about your reporting journey there.
Yeah, this was a big focus of our reporting. Newly, Parental, who is my technology reporting colleague, Newly and I really got to grips with this, and we thought, well, is there a risk of regulatory contagion, as you might call it, or is there not? Are genuinely our countries looking at Australia's lead and thinking, yeah, I fancy that? So we got together and we deployed considerable resources around the world, which Bloomberg News have. So let's get hold of policymakers and see what they're saying. And really the findings were quite remarkable. We were surprised at how many countries, how many communications ministers are either monitoring Australia's law, have engaged with Australia in some level to find out how they went about enacting this law, or they are imitating Australia's law in some fashion, maybe not exactly the same way, but in some detail, or they're plainly following Australia. And I would say from Australia on December 10th, you're looking at Brazil next March will determine that under-16s accounts must be linked to legal guardians, for instance. Malaysia plans to ban under-16s in 2026. Indonesia has said under-18s will need parental approval. Singapore has talked to Australia. They're looking at minimum age limits. And more recently, the end of November, the European Parliament voted in favour of an EU-wide minimum age of 16, with 13 to 15-year-olds requiring parental consent. So I think whether they're copying Australia exactly, I think the pattern is clear here. There is undoubtedly a wave of countries looking to rein in social media in some fashion. They're imposing age limits, or they're planning to impose age limits. So there's a recognition, I think, that social media is doing some harm. That's the conclusion among many policymakers, and they have to do something about it.
So if Australia does become the test case for banning under-16s from social media, what is the worst case scenario for big tech if this really does go global?
It's difficult exactly to know how many under-16s there are on social media, partly because it's been very easy to sign up if you're under 13. It's an age declaration. There haven't really been these age checks in place. So, depending on who you speak to or what data you look at, there are about 2 million accounts that won't be monetized from December 10 in Australia alone. If you talk to the e-Safety Commissioner, which is the online safety regulator, and if you look at the data worldwide, eMarketer says about 1 in 10 users in the US are under 18. And in some markets like Brazil, more populous emerging markets, I should say, under 18s are maybe as much as 20% of the social media account base. So if you put that into the perspective, there are 4 billion social media users worldwide. So you can do the maths. If it's between 10 and 20%, that is hundreds of millions of users potentially that may be beyond the reach of social media platforms if you enact an age limit or an age ban.
I do want to ask you a little bit more about that from the lens of parents. Angus, I know you spoke to some as part of your reporting for this article. One of the big questions that all people have, irrespective of whether or not they're a parent, is it even possible to keep kids off social media come December 10? We've talked through what's going to happen on that day. There'll be the ones that have already admitted that they're under the age, but there's going to be a lot that aren't. What did the parents that you talked to tell you about the dangers if we don't manage to get this right?
Well, this is a very emotive subject. I interviewed Emma Mason, who is the mother of Tilly, who took her own life in 2022 at the age of 15. Tilly had been bullied on social media, on Snapchat, on Instagram. And it was clear that this was a death by bullying, but in Emma Mason's words, it had been exacerbated by social media. So there are real life stories that are harrowing, no matter what side of the debate you land, that surround this law. And it's very hard not to be moved when you hear these stories of children suffering the ultimate harm in Tilly's case. Now, Emma Mason would argue that it's not worth not trying. Just because kids might get round these restrictions, it's not an argument not to try. So, and that is also an argument that the government has made on several occasions. That we have laws barring kids from tobacco, from alcohol. Now, just because some kids get round those laws, is that a reason not to have the laws in the first place? Which is a reasonable argument. I think it's It's hard to get round that just because there will be people at the fringes that get round it. So when you look at the social media ban, yes, there will be kids who create fake VPNs to get around it, so to obscure their origin of access, if you like. The kids are talking about fake masks, AI-generated images, for instance. And, we all know that a teenager can look 12 or 18, depending on the day, right? If they can be the same age. So even if you do a selfie of a kid, very hard to know exactly how old they are. So it's not watertight. The government has never claimed it to be watertight, the law, and there will be kids that get round it. But the government has said it's too important an issue not to try.
Look, I think you'd be pretty hard-pressed to get any parent say they're prepared to roll the dice with their child potentially being bullied online, and the Mason family's experience truly horrific. Nobody at all wants this. Angus, from a policy perspective, what did you learn through the course of your reporting about whether or not banning young kids from social media really addresses the root cause?
I would say back that one of the biggest weaknesses of the law is not that kids might get round it, but in the eyes of experts, kids I spoke to or interviewed along the way, is not the fact that it's ineffective and blunt. It's the fact that it doesn't actually target the problem of harmful material in itself and the algorithms that funnel that harmful material into kids' accounts. And I interviewed a schoolboy called Patrick Jones in Lennox Head, which is about 8 hours drive north of Sydney, if you're not from Australia. And he perfectly summed it up, and he said it's the content that's the problem, not our access to that content. So, are you actually solving a problem, a perceived problem at source, or are you just closing the door on it until kids turn 16 and then opening the door again? Many people would argue that the law is really flawed because it doesn't address that basic problem of harmful material.
And perhaps the most important sources in both our notebooks is our own kids. You've got some, Angus, and so do I. Mine are a bit younger. They do online safety as part of their school curriculum, and we talk about phones being tools, not toys. But these new laws for them are still a really long way away. Yours are slightly older though, so what do they make of it all?
Yeah, well, they're going to have to deal with it, aren't they? They've got a little way to go before they turn 16. Actually, got a far longer way to go now, come December 10th. But they're all over the detail, and I put it to my eldest. He said, "Oh no, Dad, it's only account holders that will be banned under the law." Because I said, "Oh, you won't be able to access social media." He says, "It's only account holders. I'll still be able to watch YouTube, just not in a logged in state." So, he's pretty smart. I was quite impressed at that. But unfortunately, I've already locked YouTube, so he won't be able to access it either way.
If you found today's conversation insightful, be sure to follow the Bloomberg Australia podcast wherever you listen, and check for more reading on Australian politics, the tech sector, and the latest reporting from Angus Whitley at bloomberg.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Gadigal people. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. I'm Rebecca Jones, and we'll see you next week.